And welcome to all of you. I am praying that the weather will hold off and wishing you all safety and good health during this period of both typhoons and the environment that we find ourselves in around the world. So thank you for having me. And I hope that this session will be one that you find beneficial and helpful. I too would like to welcome the men in the audience. 20% of you are men, and we need male allies, we need male supporters, and it's a reciprocal situation. You need us and we need you. So welcome to the men, and of course, welcome to the 80% of the women in the audience. Let me just frame what I'd like for us to accomplish during our time together today, and hope that you will find it useful. I'd like to start by giving some context, both in terms of me personally and the situation we find ourselves in, literally in the world that we are inhabiting. And then talk a little bit about higher education and the changes and transformations that higher education is going through, in part because of the COVID crisis. But the fact of the matter is, higher education has been undergoing transformation for over 2 decades. And this COVID has accelerated that transformation. But I'd like to talk a little bit about what I consider to be the phases of transformation that we find ourselves in. And then what does that mean for us as leaders, particularly those of us who are women leaders? And how do we think about leadership during transformation and during crisis? And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for us to have a dialogue and exchange. And as Vivica said, I am very pleased to stay on after the official formal program ends, and we can continue the conversation. I love conversations, so please feel free to give me feedback in the chat as we continue our conversation. So the theme for today is leading through crisis. But the second part of it is using your own talents to drive transformational change. And as we said, we are in a period of transformation and in a period of transformational change. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Let me just start with a little bit about my story to set the frame for this conversation. And I love this Chinese proverb. It actually is a human proverb. One generation plants the trees and another gets the shade. And the reality is that's my story. And I suspect it is many of your stories. I came from a family, 4th generation out of slavery. My grandparents did not have the benefit of formal higher education, of even a formal education. They were farmers in the rural South. They were, for me, my heroes and my role models. What I learned from them really gave me, made me the person I am today. But they had a vision for their children and their grandchildren, that we would do better than them. And for them, education was very core to that vision. The feeling was that education is the way out. Education allows us the freedom to grow, to expand, to meet our human potential. And that is kind of that notion of one generation plants the trees. They do the work for the next generation to get the shade, to benefit. And that's why one reason I love this Chinese proverb. And I like to say it's really human proverb, because we all are on this earth thinking that we are going to leave this earth a better place for the next generation. So Asia is undergoing a huge transformation, according to Piyush Gupta, who is the CEO of DBS Bank. And one of the things he said that really was attractive to me is the average age in Asia is 27 or 28 years old, while in the United States, it's 38. So Asia is really a very young area in the world. Europe, as you can see, is more than 40. So what does this mean to have such a young population? And you all are educators, and you know far better than me the energy that our young people bring to every situation, to learning, to growing, to transformation. And what Mr. Gupta said is that there were 4 big points about transformation in Asia. One is that Asia is a superpower. It is a superpower, and therefore must be treated as a superpower. That the demographics in Asia are really, really driving the ability for Asia to be the superpower that it is. And we just talked about the average age of being 27 or 28 years old. One thing about having a young population is that you are digitally inclined, you're digital natives. You grew up, your young people grew up in a digital environment. And then, of course, the last thing Mr. Gupta said is growth, growth, growth. Asia is growing, 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 and therefore the influence will grow. So what will drive that transformation? You all probably know far better than me because you are in academic institutions, but access to education will be fundamental to Asia's continued growth as a superpower and its continued transformation of the world, actually. So where does women play in this? We know that women have had a very challenging time. Certainly I can speak for women in my own experience and in the United States. I was the first African-American woman to serve as president of Wheelock College, and I served in that role for 12 years. And when I first became a president in 2004, the number of women presidents were only less than 25% of the colleges in Massachusetts. By the time I left in 2016, we had grown to about 49% of the college presidents in Massachusetts were women. So we did see a trajectory of growth over the 12 years that I served as a college president. But here's what Professor Rao said. Institutions of higher education in Asia also need to provide the right education to accelerate the economic, social, and political empowerment of women and to become active contributors to all aspects of national development. So what she is saying is that this growth, growth, growth that Mr. Gupta talked about must be driven by and must include women, or else Asia will not be able to reach its full potential. Now let's just pivot for a minute and talk about higher education. We know that higher education literally throughout the world has been undergoing a transformation over the past, I'd say three decades or more, with the advent of technology, with the need for more and more people to have access to higher education. So we were undergoing a conversation about what kinds of education will be needed to make it more accessible around the world. So this transformation has been under discussion for many, many years. Traditional higher education in the United States, we know relied on physical plant. It relied on the 18 to 22-year-old actually coming to a campus. And that has been under challenge. The costs are too high, not enough access, not enough students were prepared, and so on. So we have been pre-COVID. Higher education has been under great challenge. We looked at the rise of for-profit colleges. We know that our fixed costs, including an aging faculty, aging facilities, were really driving the cost and making the cost much too high. And in the United States, we saw a reduction in public funding over the past couple of decades. In your region of the world, we know that foreign institutions and foreign universities are establishing branch campuses and other forms of partnerships and relationships in Asia, in part because that was a market that we felt, that United States felt it had access to. My college and Wheelock College, we have spent the last 10 years, 15 years actually providing early education training in Singapore. So your countries, I'm sure many of your countries have seen more foreign institutions coming into your countries. But the issue of affordability and accessibility is true around the world. We know that, particularly with the growth in Asia, that we have to find a way to make higher education more accessible and more affordable for more students. So those challenges were in place pre-COVID, and higher education was under tremendous pressure pre-COVID. So what happened when COVID came? The world had to change literally overnight. And I would submit to you these 5 or 6 factors really impacted at higher education, and ask you to think about what impacted higher education in your country, in your area. We know that all institutions, no institution was spared being impacted by COVID. Whether you were the most elite institution, the strongest institution, whether you had money, or you were a struggling institution already trying to meet the challenges of financial aid, of affordability, of physical plant, and so on. Every single institution was impacted by COVID. What we saw was institutions literally, those faculties who were resisting online learning, literally overnight had to change. And we are learning, faculty are learning how to teach online. One of the things that COVID did expose for our institutions in the United States, those institutions that were vulnerable, that were resisting change, who were resisting transformation, all of their risks and vulnerabilities were exposed with COVID. And as a result, depending on who makes the pronouncement, it is expected that up to somewhere between 25 and 40% of higher education institutions in the United States may not make it through the transformation of education. And what we saw was a scrambling, more institutions merging, institutions closing with a very short notice, and this new normal of competition. Now, competition has been a big factor in higher education for the last decade or so, but what COVID brought was an even increase and more intense situation with competition. And we know that college access was impacted and will continue to be impacted. with the economic crisis that we're finding, students who are attending private colleges, um, with their parents paying for it, severely impacted. Many students have had to drop out. So we're undergoing a transformation, an accelerated transformation that higher education has been undergoing for the last few decades. Here's the thing about women. What we're finding about women in the workplace in general is that women are losing ground. They are leaving the workforce. Some recent data that has come out in the United States, at least 25 to 40% of women are thinking about either pulling back or leaving the workforce in completely because of COVID, because of economic strains, financial strains, the strain of managing family and professional work. And so there is a great deal of concern about the progress that women have made over this past decade and what COVID will actually do to drag us backwards, where that we will probably lose ground. So I'd like to ask you to just think about what's happening in your own area, in your own country, in your own area, city, or community that your institution serves. So I'd like to think about higher education post-COVID in three basic movements. I think that we are moving towards transformation, but we are still in the process of understanding what that actually means for higher education. Right now, we're still in crisis. We are still trying to manage through the crisis. We are trying to understand how we can pivot, how we can just keep our doors open, how we can better serve our students and our families, and how we can maintain high faculty achievement, how we can structure and manage our institutions through this period. Institutions are having to literally make decisions almost on a daily basis. So here in the United States, we thought that many institutions thought that they could open on their normal schedule, and they attempted to do that. And then we would have an outbreak, or they found out that actually they couldn't open. So literally with very little notice, they decided that they would go on completely online. So we're still in this crisis phase. And my thinking is that we probably have to go through at least one more cycle of admission, of starting and closing, at least one more cycle before we've figured out what higher education should be transforming to, how we're going to look post-COVID. So phase two is what I call the pivot to transformation. We don't know exactly what that will be. Even our institutions that are, very, very solid, very strong, very stable, we don't know what the transformation will be. What will be the combination of learning? How will we excite students? How will we keep them engaged? What happens to our campuses? So this pivot to transformation, how will we use all of these facilities? Maybe they're going to be a new way of engaging with community. We'll probably have to have a new way of making higher education more accessible and available and affordable for certain. So this pivot to transformation may take us 2 to 3 years. So I'm thinking that as we come towards the second half of this decade, probably 2026, 2027, we may see an entire new system of higher education throughout the world. And so I'd just like to ask you to think about what transformation means, what it will mean in your community, what it will mean for Asia as the superpower, what it will mean for women in higher education, what it will mean for us personally and professionally. So Victoria, we're going to ask to take a small poll, a short, brief poll, and ask the question for those of you who are working in higher education institutions, how prepared is your institution for transformation? Well prepared, somewhat prepared, unsure, not prepared. Are we getting responses, Victoria? Ah. So 11% of you feel you're well prepared. That's terrific. I'm not sure if we did the same poll with my colleagues here in Massachusetts. 66% of you, 2/3 of you say you're somewhat prepared. So that's 77%. Unsure about 20%, and not prepared about 4%. I want to say to you that Asia continues to be a superpower, because I will tell you that my sense, if I gave this same poll to 500 institutions in the United States, I don't think we'd get 2/3 of them feeling they're either well prepared or somewhat prepared. I think people are really, really concerned about the future, particularly private institutions that rely on tuition and are tuition driven, particularly institutions that have been reluctant or slow to transform from a traditional higher education, a mode of educating. So I want to congratulate you and commend you, because I think those numbers are really, really good. And it shows me that you have adapted very well to your role in the region, your role in the world, particularly around accessibility and affordability for higher education. And I suspect so many of you were able to say well prepared or somewhat prepared. I suspect that you all were already doing a fair amount of online learning. You probably already were engaged in partnerships and collaborations, and you probably had already started pivoting towards the adjustment to a new transformation in higher education. So I want to ask you to think about, as we go through this presentation, whether you think the three modes that I have articulated make sense, that we're moving from a crisis mode, and do you still feel that you're in that category, and moving towards and pivoting towards a transformation, and what you think the transformation in higher education in Asia will be when we're in the new normal, post-COVID, post changes that we're all making in higher education. So thank you very much for participating in this poll. I really respect where you are and where you're thinking your institutions of higher education will be over this next period of time. Let's, now that we have this context of higher education, of what we think is happening in terms of transforming higher education, and what may be happening to women in Asian institutions of higher education. Will we still have the same opportunities? Are we going to be voluntarily pulling back and moving back. What do we think will be the leadership opportunities for women during this transformed higher education? I love this, this slide, this photograph, because we know that transformation will require leadership. Nothing transforms without leadership. And I would submit to you, transformation requires courageous leadership. Those of us who've worked in higher education for a long time, we know that higher education is very reluctant to change. Our institutions have been in existence for, for as little as a few years to many centuries. And change has been very, very challenging for higher education. And so we know that transformation, and if we are in a transformation mode, will require leadership. And I would just add that additional word, it will require courageous leadership, it will require focused leadership, and it will require leadership that is willing to take the necessary stands for our institutions to be able to thrive. Right now, many of our institutions of higher education are not in a thriving mode. So leadership will be required. So how do we define leadership? When you think about leadership, how do you define leadership? What do you think about? And when you think about leadership, what attributes do you think are really important in leadership? Let me give you a definition that I love. And this is a definition of leadership that came from John Quincy Adams, who was one of the early presidents. So this definition is about 200 years old. And what he said 200 years ago is, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. So he didn't talk about protocols, structure. He talked about inspiration. He talked about what inspires people to reach their full potential. And that goes back to the Chinese proverb of one generation planting the trees so the next one can get the shade. We really want to inspire people to reach their full potential. So my question for you is, what qualities do you think make a leader? What tools are needed for leaders to be able to achieve John Quincy Adams' goal of inspiring others to dream more, learn more, do more, become more? In other words, to reach their full potential. That's one of our duties in terms of being a leader. I think that they're leadership drivers, and I want to just share two ways of thinking about leadership with you. I think about responsive leadership. For me, leadership involves being responsive to the people, the organization, the structure, the mission, the values, what drives that institution, its history, its saga, it's what makes that institution, the unique institution that it is. And all 4,000 plus institutions of higher education, each one is unique. Each one is different. And I would submit to you the same thing with your institutions of higher education in Asia. Each one of your institutions are unique. And so when I think of leadership, I think about responsive leadership. Responsive leadership focuses on the people, the humanity in the organization and the opportunities that that organization has. And decision-making is based on the people that drives the organization. We know that organizations that have thrived, that have been responsive to its people, they are the ones that get that organization through both the ups and the downs. Even when we look at COVID, it is the people in those organizations who worked night and day to pivot literally overnight. So I like to think about leadership in terms of responsive leadership. And I would submit to you that women tend to, or are more inclined to be responsive leaders. And as Vivica said earlier, we know that particularly during COVID, we have seen women thrive and do well. And I would submit or ask you to think about responsive leadership. Now, general leadership are tools that we use. General leadership is often focused on the organizational structure. It's focused on systems, protocols, ways of doing business, organizational cultural. Decision-making is often not based on the humanity of the organization, but it's based on some other factors, such as profit, or such as, organizational structures that will drive our decision-making. And very often in higher education, we have seen the shared governance issues that drove decision-making. Faculty over here, administrators over here, board and governance over there. And so decision-makings weren't necessarily driven by the needs of the student or the needs of the people, but it was driven by these factions that were often competing and not able to function well together. So what are responsive leadership attributes? When I think about responsive leadership, what drives responsive leadership? I like to say that, responsive leaders wear their values on their sleeves. We know what drives them, and it's a value-driven leadership. And I feel after a lot of thinking and writing and research, I've come up with 4 leadership attributes that I think drive responsive leadership. Now, there are many, many ways of thinking about leadership attributes, but in my opinion, these 4 kind of encompass so many leadership attributes. So let me just tell you why I came up with these particular 4. The first is curiosity. I think that responsive leaders are curious. They want to know, what are the best ways for my organization to thrive? They are constantly in a learning mode. We use that term continuous learning, but it is actually true. Responsive leaders are continuously learning. And I think curiosity drives innovation. People say, well, we want our organization to be innovative. The way your organization is innovative is driven by curiosity, because we're always learning and we're always growing. Responsive leaders who are curious are not only curious about the industry that they work in, that they're, in our case, higher education, what's driving higher education, how is it changing, how do we change with it, how do we make sure our organization is understanding what's impacting it, but they're curious about the people in the organization. How are they doing? How are they doing during this COVID crisis? They take the time to listen to them, to understand what motivates them, to understand what their challenges are. So curiosity is kind of a core attribute that will drive an organization. The second is humility. Now, those of us in the United States, we are this is a leadership, of course, is on top of mind right now. And humility is often coming up. Humility says, number one, I know that even though I am the leader, I can't do this alone. Humility says I can learn from, I can grow from others. And I think curiosity and humility are very much linked together. Because if you're a curious person, you know you are learning and growing and you need others. I once read something that said curiosity is spirit knocking. And I loved that because spirit will drive us to want to know more, do more, be more. And it drives humility, that we know we can't do this alone. We need others. And others can contribute to my own learning and growth. The other leadership attribute that I feel is part of what I call the big four is empathy. The ability, no, we can't necessarily walk in someone else's shoes, but we can certainly try to learn. We can try to be a partner with them. And empathy helps to drive humility. And these all three fit together. And then the final of the four big four attributes is resilience. The ability to get back up when I've been knocked down, the ability to keep moving, the ability to understand that this too shall pass, that we will get through this and get through this together. Now, as a woman, and I said to you, I was the first African-American woman president of Wheelock College. Growing up in the United States as a woman and an African-American woman, we kind of were taught, how do we succeed in this world that we're in? And I think I want to ask the women in the audience if you can relate to any of this. Here's what I grew up being told. Here's what came into my DNA, that I've got to work twice as hard, usually for less recognition, less pay, but you cannot just think you can slide along. You have to work twice as hard. And I've got to be smarter, faster, stronger, just to have a chance, just to be able to sit at the table and play the game. And the ability to make mistakes that others can make, I didn't feel I had that no mistake, no mistake, no mistakes. It's kind of what was driven into us as women, driven into me as a woman and as an African-American woman. And we relied very much on faith. You know, that's that resilience. People ask, well, how do you get resilience? Resilience was very much part of our spirit, part of our ability to have faith. So those were the tools that I grew up with in another generation. And I would ask you to think, particularly the women in the audience, what are the tools that you think you need in order to get ahead? What are your tools? Do you still think you have to work harder? Do you still think you have to be smarter? What are the barriers that we are finding, you are finding in higher education? Do you have room to make can you make a big mistake and still not feel that it's going to impact your advancement? And I would ask you to think about how does technology factor today into advancement for women? Now, I want to tell you, I actually shared this with a group of young middle managers in a high-tech company. They were people of color, African-American. And I talked about some of my experiences, you know, several decades ago. I've got some gray hair here, as you can see. And you know what? they told me that these same tools that I grew up with, these same ways of thinking and doing, they still felt that. This is a big high-tech company. So that was both for me very, very depressing. It was very discouraging because I wanted to believe that all of these decades later, people of color, women, had overcome this, that we didn't have to work twice as hard. We didn't have to worry about making mistakes. We didn't have to be faster. So for the women in the audience, think about what barriers, not just you are facing in your institution, but what barriers are women facing in the workforce, in the world? The women that you are training and the women who are matriculating in your institutions. So let me just pause for a moment. I'd love for you just to quickly reflect on this segment of the presentation. Do these attributes make sense? Do the tools for advancement for you, for women, what are the tools? What are the barriers? I'd just like to ask you to just take a couple of minutes. I'd love for you to put some comments in the chat box or question box about this. Challenge me, particularly around what I call the big four, the four attributes: curiosity, humility, empathy, and resilience. So let's just take a quick moment to take a breath, to take a breather, and to reflect. This is going. So I see we're getting short on time. So I'm going to quickly share with you 7 tools of responsive leaders that I think can help drive the conversation that we're going to have, and certainly our important leadership tools that will be needed as we move into this transformation of higher education. The first is take advantage of opportunity. And we are really in an opportunity right now with COVID. We have a great opportunity for women leaders. And I would just encourage you to step up and take advantage. A key to responsive leadership is understanding when we have an opportunity. And some people do not view COVID as an opportunity, but I would submit to you that it's an opportunity for your institution and for you. Compete well by leading with the heart. If we put the humanity of the organization, of your institution first, it used to be that we were told that we can't lead with the heart, that that's, quote, soft. But what we're learning is that heart matters, because heart responds to mission, it responds to values, and we let our values drive. It drives our institutions and drives how we make decisions. Keep your bags packed. Now, some of you are wondering, what the heck does keep your bags packed mean? And I will just tell you a very quick story. Keep your bags packed says that at some point in our career, we will be challenged. Our integrity will be challenged. We will be asked to compromise our values. And if we don't understand what drives us, if we don't have a mentality that I call the keep your bags packed mentality, we will find ourselves in a situation that causes us a great deal of pain. So if we have a mentality that, you know what, there are certain things that I cannot compromise, that's what I call the keep your bags packed mentality. Stay focused during times of crisis. Now, we are in a crisis right now, and sometimes we can be all over the place. We can be, You know, we can jump from one thing to another, but responsive leaders will stay focused. They'll be very clear about what the goal is, what they're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to achieve. So we must stay focused. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't change, we don't adjust, we don't pivot, but we need to make that adjustment and that pivot in a very focused way. Understand the opposition. And this is something that women very often have a hard time with. It took me a while to learn this, but there will always be opposition in our organizations. And it's very important that we understand what's driving the opposition. First, to figure out where the opposition is. It's as important to understand the opposition as it is to make sure we aligned with our allies, people who are supporting the decisions we're making. And when we get into the small group discussions, we can talk a little bit more about this one. I particularly like it. And then the value, the interconnectedness of people. So often our organizations have us working in silos, and higher education is a perfect example of how our institutions were driven by silos. And what we have learned is that we are all connected. Archbishop Desmond Tutu talks about Ubuntu. In order for me to be all I can be, you have to be all you can be. And we're all interconnected. So in order for my department to do well, I have to understand how I have to work with the other departments in my institution. And then finally, recover quickly. We will all stumble. Our institutions are stumbling right now in COVID. And the question is, how quickly can we cover? How quickly can we adjust? How quickly can we pivot so that we can keep our organizations going, keep our spirit going as a leader, and be the kind of responsive leader that our organization will need. So those are 7 tools that I think drives responsive leadership and helps our organizations to thrive. And I'd love for us to talk about them a little more and hear what you think about them. So as we come to a close, we're going to do just another very quick poll, Victoria. And how are you feeling about the future of women in higher education in Asia? Very optimistic, somewhat optimistic, unsure, cautiously pessimistic, or very concerned? How are we doing, Victoria? Ah, thank you. Ah, so about almost 90% of you feel optimistic and somewhat optimistic. Now, is this the nature of Asians? You are generally a very optimistic population. That's great. Let me just close by saying we started off by talking about the Chinese proverb, one generation plants the trees and the next one gets the shade. You are the bridge. You're the bridge between those who came before us and those who will be coming after us. You're planting and nurturing the trees. And so I thank you so much for all that you're doing to advance higher education in Asia. And I'd just like to leave you with the words of Yuri Kochimama. Consciousness is power. Consciousness is education and knowledge. Consciousness is becoming aware. Tomorrow's world is yours to build, and I would say to maintain. So thank you very, very much. I have enjoyed talking with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that will follow.